One thing is certain, the future of work will look different than it used to. Today on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, we have a guest to help us think about the future of work. Are you ready? Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you lead more confidently and make a bigger difference, both professionally and personally. This episode is sponsored by From Manager to Remarkable Leader, Kevin's flagship workshop based on his proven leadership model. Learn more at remarkablepodcast.com/manager. And now here's your host, Kevin.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. So glad that you're with me. First episode in March of 2021, but we're recording this several weeks before that. My guest today is Jeff Schwartz. Let me tell you about Jeff, and then we'll dive in. He is the founding partner of Deloitte Consulting's U.S. Future of Work practice and the global editor of the Global Human Capital Trends Report. He has led research on the evolution of work, workforces, and workplace practices, and advised clients around the world on workforce transformation. A global consultant, he's lived and worked in the US, India, Russia, Belgium, Kenya, and Israel. His thinking on the future of work and talent strategies and publications, including Deloitte Review, Sloan Management Review, the Rotman Review, and the Wall Street Journal. His new book is titled Work Disrupted: Opportunity, Resilience, and Growth in an Accelerated Future of Work, was released in January of 2021. Like my last guest, the guest that I actually talked to yesterday, he started his career in the Peace Corps. He was a volunteer in Nepal and later served as one of the first associate directors of the Peace in the Russian Federation. He is a graduate of Yale School of Management, has an MBA in the Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs, and he resides in New York City, and he's our guest today. And Jeff, I'm glad that you're here. Welcome.
I'm really delighted to be with you today, Kevin, and I'm exhausted just listening to that bio. So hopefully we'll.
I'm so glad that your mother wrote that for me to use. I'm glad to hear that. So you don't wake up when you're 12 years old. You don't even wake up likely when you're at Princeton or Yale and say, I'm going to be the guru of the future of work. Like, that's probably not what happened, I'm guessing. You're about my age, so you were probably thinking, at one point, like astronaut or something like that. So tell us a little bit about the journey. How did you end up doing this kind of work? Just quickly give us the thumbnail view of your journey.
That's a great question. So when I was in second grade, for those of our listeners who are here in the US, but almost anywhere in the world, they would ask us in elementary school what we wanted to be when we grew up. And I remember being asked to draw a picture, and I was limited by the fact that I really couldn't draw pictures of too many occupations. So apparently when I was 7, I wanted to be a fireman because I could draw a fireman.
You got a red crayon. What more do you need, right?
You got a red hat. It was very easy to sort of, so I'm not sure what a picture of a future of work guru would have looked like and whether I could have figured that out when I was 7. So it's a really interesting question. And it's obviously one of the themes, not only of my book, but of my life. I studied at university. My first degree is in literally intellectual history, the history of ideas. And I picked that because it was interesting to me. And
your mom said, how are you going to make a living at that?
Well, look, I come from a particular generation where, look, your mom wanted you to be, my mom, may she rest in peace. Look, they either wanted you to be a doctor or a lawyer or maybe an accountant, maybe a professor, things that they could identify with. Management consultants, bankers, venture capitalists, inventors, startup entrepreneurs were not on the list of what we were looking at. And so I think it really goes back to never losing my sense of curiosity and feeling comfortable and having the confidence to pursue my sense of curiosity. So that whether that was studying intellectual history or taking a year after university and working in a small foundation, the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Foundation, working in youth policy in the early 1980s, going into the Peace Corps, in part because I wrote a report in the early 1980s on the Peace Corps. 1980 was the 20th anniversary of the Peace Corps in 1981. We wrote a report. I remember interviewing Dick Celeste, who was the director of the Peace Corps in 1980 and 1981. And I met all these people who had these amazing experiences, every one of whom said, if there's one thing I would do again in my life, I would sign up for the Peace Corps again. So I signed up for the Peace Corps. And I ended up hitting the lottery. I was assigned to be a math science teacher in Nepal. Now, to be honest, Kevin, I didn't know where Nepal was. I had to look it up in the World Book Encyclopedia. There was no, this is 1981, there was no World Wide Web, there was no Wikipedia. Literally, I went over to the encyclopedia, and so there it is, this beautiful country that's situated between India and China. And from there, I sort of started to explore more. And as we talked about occupations earlier, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. So I deferred law school the whole time I was in the Peace Corps, and then figured out I was more interested in institutions and how things work, and had this crazy idea of going both to business school and public policy school at the same time. And then a couple of years after that, I found my way into banking, and then shortly after that into management consulting, which has been a tremendous fit for me. I've been in management consulting probably for 35, 40 years, 25 years as a partner. And it's an occupation where you don't do the same thing ever twice. So it's really been a journey about curiosity, and hopefully that's something we'll be able to talk more about in the talk today. I think what's different about this book are really two things. One, there's a quote from Albert Einstein, which is that you can't use an old map to explore a new world. And that really is the essence of the book Work Disrupted, which is that to understand and to navigate and to manage 21st century careers and 21st century work, we need to have a new set of maps and mental models to do it. And that's really the way the book is laid out. I think the second difference in this book is many of the great books that have been written and articles on the future of work don't take a landscape view. They divide it up. There's great work on technology and humans and how they work together. There's great work on the virtual workplace. There's great work on how workforces are changing. There are books on the gig economy and the gig worker. There are books on careers. What I try to do, and maybe it's ambitious, is to introduce ourselves as both business leaders and as workers and professionals and as students to what is this 21st century landscape, and how is it different than the 20th century, and why is it useful to have these new mental models and these new perspectives for the way the world is organized going forward.
So you talked about two big things in that conversation there, in that answer, both of which I wanted to address. So let's talk about that first one, about the need for new maps. And I love that because we are of roughly the same age. You made a comment about the Rand McNally Road Atlas in the back of the car. My dad used to throw me the atlas and say, here's where I want to go. Give me 3 ways to get there. And so I love the Rand McNally. I just read this morning, by the way, that it is one of the best-selling books of the first half of this month. So be that as it may, there are other maps, right, that we need to look at. And so talk a little bit more about the need for these different maps. And then maybe more importantly, what do you suggest we look at instead of the way we've been looking at things?
Yeah. So, I mean, I love the notion of that paper atlas, which was stuck between the passenger seat and the driver's seat in many of our family cars for many years. And of course, today, some people are using those maps. Many more of us are using some version of Google Maps or Waze. I actually met the founder of Waze in Israel a couple of years ago, and there are a couple of things about Waze that I think are very relevant here. First is when they created Waze, that technology, one of the things they looked at is, do we go out and do we buy all the digital maps out there and then improve them? Then they figured out, we could actually create the maps just by mapping where people are driving and using the data based on where they go. Sort of interesting, which is you don't have to ask somebody, is this road open? Or when is this road going to be built? But when cars start traveling on that road and transmitting data, that road makes it onto the map, right? So the travelers are creating the maps, not the map makers. That's very interesting flip. And the other is, when there's an accident or when there's a diversion, you want to know about that real time, right? What you also want to know about is there a new way to travel the route, right? So we're used to the notion that when you open up your map on your map app, if you will,
Yeah.
it not only gives you directions, it asks you, do you want to walk? Do you want to take a bicycle? If there's a bus route, what the bus route is. If there's a train route, what the train route is. If there's a scooter route, where you can rent a scooter. If you're in India, where the 3-wheelers are available. I mean, all those things are available to you. So not only what the routes could be, but what are the different ways that you can actually go on the journey. These are the kind of maps that we need for the 21st century, right? So that's sort of number one. They're dynamic and they're multidimensional, right? The other piece that's sort of interesting. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. The other piece, that's interesting about maps is recognizing that when the world changes, you need a new map, right? So if you go, I spent several years living in India, including working in Gurgaon, which is one of the major cities next to New Delhi. And if you were in Gurgaon 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or last year, it's one of these cities in the world that's changing so fast that whatever map you have is going to be outdated, right? And in a world changing at the rate that our world is changing, we need to make sure that we're updating these perspectives. And let me just give 2 examples, because what I really try to do in the book is look, it's really a from to discussion, Kevin, right? We used to think that the way that people and technology work together was this way, but really we need to think about it in another way. So we used to think, and for many years, we're still thinking that people and technology, people and robots are in competition, right? It's the substitution effect, right? That's what I would call the predominant and old way of looking at it. I think the evolving way of looking at it, the new mental model, is how can people and technology work together and complement one another to do new things, working and leveraging the strength of either, right?
So let's say a little bit more about that, because I think that when you talk to a lot of people about the future of work and you start to talk about AI, and people get, the technical term is freaked out. Like, what does that really mean? And part of it is substitution. Am I going to lose my job? But like, what does that actually look like? So walk us through for a second. What does artificial intelligence in the workplace look like in the near term and in maybe the longer term?
Yeah, so it makes me a little bit nervous. So I was listening to some of the sessions you had earlier, and you've talked to a number of futurists, some of whom think it's very difficult to predict and understand the future. I guess, and I will give you 2 examples, but my view on the future now is we're in a unique position in 2021 because we all lived through 2020. And in 2020, we all became futurists, right? As Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's the president of the New America Foundation, said actually last March, the coronavirus is a time machine to the future. And things that we thought would take 5 years or 10 years took 5 weeks, and in some case, actually less than that. So in an interesting way, we have seen elements of the future in 2020. Things not only happen faster, that's why I call this book Work Disrupted, not Work Accelerated. I think that what we saw in 2020 was not just that things went faster, but they literally leapt ahead. You know, we started 2020, 5% of the workforce was working at home part of the time. By mid-year, it was 50%. Right? That's 10x. We talk about exponential change, Kevin. We actually saw it in 2020. So we know something about the future. But let me give 2 examples. I'll try to be quick on them just to give a sense. And they're very different examples, and both of which we talk about in the book. One is the ATM machine, the automated teller machine. The reason I love this example is it's a pervasive technology around the world. It was only invented in 1979, 1980. And one could have imagined that when we invented the automated teller machine, that the number of retail bankers in the United States and around the world would have plummeted. Because when I was growing up, when you went to a bank branch, you deposited money and you got money, right? That's what you did at the bank branch, right? Yep. And now that's being done by a machine that's outside the bank. You don't even have to go inside the building. It's open 24 hours, right? But what happened in the last 30, 40 years? We've seen an incredible increase in the number of bank branches. We've seen the rate of growth of retail branch bankers, right, has been an above average growth compared to other industries. Right. So it's not only did it not go away, more people are doing it. But what happened? They're not doing the same job. Okay. A retail bank branch person today, okay, is helping you with a loan. It's helping you with a credit application. It's helping you deal with a fraud or a cyber issue. That's the last time I went to a bank branch. I actually had to deal with a fraud issue. A check was whitewashed. Somebody stole the check that I sent to my dad because he likes the physical checks, and they changed the name and they changed the amount. And, you know, I felt in that situation, I wanted to be sitting with somebody in the bank branch, right? More people doing the work, different work entirely disrupted, right? I'll give one other quick example because this is, I think, one of the most interesting ideas that I've heard in looking at how AI affects the way that we work. This is in medical care, radiology. Eric Topol, Dr. Topol, wrote a wonderful book called Deep Medicine. And he talks about what is going to happen to radiologists. Because today, what we know is that AI algorithms can read digital scans as well or better than the average or a really good radiologist, right? And, you know, there's 2 views. One is that radiologists are going to go away, right? That's the robot apocalypse. Right. The other is humanity unleashed. So literally, Dr. Topol talks about the Renaissance radiologist. What does the radiologist do when she can use algorithms to make faster and better diagnoses, right? And what he points out is what doctors get to do is they have the gift of time. They can spend more time on what he calls deep care, right? So yes, maybe they can do diagnostics faster. Maybe, as in the ATM machine, they can give the money out faster. The real opportunity now, and this is not an easy question, is what is the Renaissance version of what you're doing? What's the version of people and technology doing new things that's going to add value and work out for people? Maybe that was a bit of a long answer, but I think it's this change. It's that, you know, all of our work is going to change, and there's a big reinvention component that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really great, those are great examples, and it's a great point. And I think a moment of hopefulness, right? Because I opened by saying people are freaked out, and some people are, but I think that a lot of people are worried, well, my work's going to go away. And what you're saying is work's going to change, and hopefully actually for the better as that changes, which is great. So you talked a little bit about the pandemic, COVID-19, and we talked about it as an accelerant. It gave us a chance to see the future in real time and that sort of thing. how will that experience that we've lived through, are living through, alter the future of work?
So we're living through it now. We're in the work that we do at Deloitte. We've and others have talked about the trajectory of living through a crisis, the recovery period, the response period, the recovery period, and the thrive period. We're in the extended recovery period, right? We are still working it through here in the first quarter of 2021. Um, two main observations here to share, Kevin. One is, how do we think about what happened in 2020 and what's happening in early 2021? Was COVID a detour, or is COVID an on-ramp to a new way of working? Look, you know what my perspective is on it, right?
I do. Yeah.
It's not a detour, right? And we are not going back to what we had before. We've literally spent 18 months in the future, right? And what we're trying to figure out now is what the preferred futures are. What are the directions that we want to go in?
I think that's the critical, I think right there is the critical question, even in the short term, for leaders in organizations and leaders of teams in the next several months, is what are we going to do next, right? We're going to bring, being very practical, are we going to bring everybody back to the office? Are we going to bring some people back? How often? How, in what format? And all sorts of, I mean, there's some very immediate and practical questions that will be wrestled with this year around that very point.
I think that's right. And I think the key point that, well, the key point that I want to highlight is when we talk about the future of work. I think one of the most interesting interviews in the book, we interviewed Lewis Simons, a labor history professor at Cornell. We were talking about employment models. And at one point, I literally asked Lewis, so what are employment models going to look like in 2030? Right? Are we going to have more gig workers? Are we going to have more part-time workers? Are we going to have more crowd workers? And Lewis, we were on the phone, but I could hear him smile. And he said, well, the future isn't predetermined. We have choices, right? And I think that's what's so interesting about the question that you're asking, which is, where do we go with our COVID response and our COVID recovery and what we do next? We have choices. And I actually don't think the question is how many days a week we should be working in the office and how many days a week we should be working from home. I think the questions that we can be exploring right now is, for the work that we're trying to do in ways that work for our professional and personal lives, how do we use all these options that we have in front of us? I mean, we're recording this on Zoom. It could be Zoom, it could be Teams, it could be Skype, it could be Google Hangouts. There's some great technology, but this is pretty amazing technology, right? And are there limitations? Is it in everyone's house and everyone's apartment? Not yet, but we're going to get there. Right?
But we're close. We're on the last mile.
And,
for sure.
And it's a big priority. Bringing the internet to rural communities and urban deserts is a big priority, and I think countries around the world are focusing on it. My point is that we actually have choices to think about, how do we structure the work differently, right? So that it's more productive, that it works better with our personal lives. Again, I mean, I'm working from home. Somebody knocked on the door. We're working in each other's living rooms, and there are pluses and minuses to that. Look, not many of us are okay with the fact that we're commuting less, right? And but we're also missing much of the social interaction of being in the office. So, and I'll give one other example. I think when we go back to the office, or go back to the campus, or go back to the factory, we're going to look at the way that we use that physical space differently, right? Because work that can be done remotely probably should and could be done remotely. But things that can uniquely be done when people are together, training sessions, design sessions, certain kinds of strategic and inspirational meetings, I think we'll be more purposeful about the way that we use physical space and the way that we use remote space. And I think that the choices we have going forward become really, really quite important and probably need to be more deliberate than they've been in the past.
Well, in our work, we talk a lot about being intentional with the choices, right? And I think that's exactly what you're saying. And so, on that note, I will say that this episode is being brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Teammate. Stay engaged and connected while working anywhere. You can learn more by going to longdistanceteammate.com, because there's a big difference between working from home and being a member of a successful remote team. So, one of the questions, Jeff, that I was asked after I finished one of my earlier books, because as you and I both know, you finish the book and then there's time before the rest of the world gets to see it. And in your case, actually in ours as well, with the Long Distance Teammate, same. Some really interesting things happened between when you finished and when it came out. So the question I was asked, and I like to ask authors this question, is, so what have you learned since the book was finished? Or another way of asking basically the same question is, knowing what you know now, what do you wish you could have put in the book?
So I had the incredible luck, Kevin, of sending the book to the publisher Wiley June 30th. So I had 3.5 months of COVID experience, the first 3.5 months. And I'm in New York, and it hit us pretty hard. It hit us very hard in New York. And I also had the benefit or not of not traveling for a year. I'm a road warrior. I mean, I early March, I was in Tel Aviv, then I was in San Francisco, then I came back to New York the first week in March. And so I've been here.
March the 5th, my last airplane.
I'm sorry, where?
March the 5th was my last.
March the 5th, right? And people remember where it was. And the airlines are calling us saying, where are you? You're a frequent flyer. When are you coming back? I think the one thing that I would probably, the one thing I would hit even harder, right? Is the amount of opportunity that we have in front of us right now is immense, right? I mean, one of the themes of the book is just riffing on the idea of creative destruction. It's an idea that's 70, 80 years old from Joseph Schumpeter. When people hear creative destruction, it's interesting. More people hear the word destruction than hear the word creative. When people, work disrupted is not about the disruption. It's about the creation. It's about the opportunity. And it's very hard to focus on that. And one of the ideas that I really try to build on, and it's a great idea from Carol Dweck, who has written extensively on the growth mindset. So much of this, I think, so much of what we have in front of us is a function of the growth mindset and the lenses that we put on to think about what is possible. And I guess the other point that I'll make is I wish that I think we have more of an opportunity to set new directions every day, right? I know, and I've heard a couple of the episodes that you've recorded in the last few months, and one of the things that you've discussed with some of your guests is the role of goals and the role of setting direction. And I think this is a really important time to set some ambitious direction, whether it's for you as an individual or as an organizational leader or as a community. And that's part of the way we look at the story, which is right. These disruptions affect us as individuals, as business and organizational members, and as citizens.
So you've given us a number of things, tangible things to think about. But if you had one other piece of advice for leaders at any level today, what other advice would you give beyond what you've already given to help us think about the future of work? What other thing would you want to leave us with?
I think the other thing is a major part of the book and my thinking is if workforces and workplaces are changing and we have this huge set of opportunities, what does this mean for how I lead in terms of structuring careers? What does it mean for the way we actually organize ourselves? And what does it mean for how we lead and manage? Or put another way, if workforces and workplaces are being disrupted, what does that mean for careers, organizational strategies, and managers? And this section of the book is organized around the idea of resilience. What does a 50, 60-year career look like in a 100-year life? Riffing on the idea from Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott, who wrote a book called The 100-Year Life. And in a 100-year life, a 50-year career, it's not, 1, 2, 3. It's not train, work, retire. Our lives are portfolios of lifelong reinvention, right? How do you build a career of lifelong reinvention as an individual, as an organization? As thinking about organizations, we know, and you talked about teams a moment ago, teams are the center of action, right? Organizational strategies are being redesigned around teams and ecosystems and networks, right? Am I focused as a leader and as an employee and a worker on my role as part of a team, as part of a network? And then in terms of leadership and management, the expression I like to bring up, the image I like to bring up is leaders aren't standing there anymore with a clipboard. They're not assigning the roster to who's on the
Let's
field.
hope not.
The leaders today and managers today are player coaches. They're on the field. They understand how the work itself and how the dynamics are changing. They're focused on individual performance and team performance, but they're also playing multiple roles. Sometimes you're a coach, sometimes you're a designer, sometimes you're a cultural anthropologist, sometimes you're a psychologist. Actually start the chapter on 21st century management by reminding myself and us that when Danny Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics, it was really interesting because for those of us who know behavioral economics, Danny Kahneman's a psychologist. He never took an economics class, but he changed the way we think about management, right? So I think that my point is think about resilience across these different areas. And then lastly, think about the importance of not just managing cost and efficiency. Think about what we're doing as leaders and managers and individuals to create value and to create new sources of value in the work that we're doing. Because it's in innovation that we really create value. It's not in optimization.
And the list of choices before us are significant, and I think that's a big theme that we can all take from this time. So before we finish, Jeff, I have a couple of sort of questions not related to the book and the work. And the first one is this: what do you do for fun?
Well, what do I do for fun in COVID is different than what I do for fun. I did for fun before. So if you had asked me this question last year, before March 10th or 13th, I would say I travel and I spend time with my family. I have 2 daughters who are 26 and 29. One's in Utah, one's in Georgia and Atlanta. So I get to do that, but I do that remotely. But basically, I'm a huge reader. And I'm also a pretty good, I'm a big walker and a big hiker. So I'm doing about 6-7 miles a day, which I've been keeping up through most of the COVID period. So walking and hiking and reading are what keep me busy when I'm not doing the work of a Deloitte partner.
Speaking of reading, what are you reading right now?
So my partner, Kate, always kids me about the fact that, do you really need to get a book a day delivered to you from Amazon?
Why, yes, you do, Jeff.
You absolutely do. The book is a wonderful physical technology. So I'm actually in the middle of 2 books. I'm just finishing Scott Galloway's book called Post-Corona, which Scott, I think, teaches at NYU. And he's written quite a bit about technology and work. And I really like this thinking about what's happening next. But the book that I'm really into the middle of is Walter Isaacson's biography of Leonardo da Vinci. Because I think we have a Renaissance moment coming, and I'm becoming very interested in understanding what the Renaissance was about. And I mentioned earlier the Renaissance radiologist that was called up by Eric Topol. So those are the two things that I'm in the middle of right now.
Who better to learn about the Renaissance than from Mr. Da Vinci? So now the question you've been wanting me to ask from the very beginning: where can we learn more about you, your work, the book? Where do you want to point people, Jeff?
Well, the best single place to learn about the book is to go to Deloitte.com, the Deloitte website. And then Deloitte.com, somebody will remind me whether it's / or /, whichever one it's supposed to be, and then work disrupted.
Slash.
So it's / work disrupted. And you'll see both the research that I've done and the writing I've done. You'll also see, I think we have all 11 years of the human capital trends research that we've done. And we just issued a report in December of last year, which is very focused on, actually the title of the report is "The Social Enterprise in a World Disrupted, Leading the Transition from Survive to Thrive." So it's exactly what we've been talking about today on this discussion, because that's really what we're in the middle of in 2021 is this transition from survive to thrive.
Jeff Schwartz, the author of Work Disrupted. You can find the book also wherever you buy fine books. And like Jeff and I, you buy one every day. So why not make this one next? Now a question for all of you before we wrap up, for all of you that have been watching or listening. And by the way, if you only listen, you could watch. Here's the question. Now what? Jeff has given you plenty to think about. He's outlined a plethora of choices that are before us. He's given us plenty of perspective to think backward to help us think forward. The question is, what are you going to do with this? Because if you don't take any action, while this might have been enjoyable, it might even have been entertaining, it really won't have been valuable. And the value will come from the action that you take. And I know that Jeff and I both hope that that's exactly what you do. Jeff, thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Kevin. Really enjoyed it.
And before we go, everybody, we'd love for you to join the conversation, get updates, have a hand on how this podcast evolves, and even join us for some of the future episodes that are live. You can do that by joining our Facebook group or our LinkedIn group. You can just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast/LinkedIn /Facebook/LinkedIn. Give us a recommendation. Let us know what you think. Join the community. And speaking of the community, we're here next week. So please be back for the next episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.